All stand, please. Please be seated.
Thanks, Mr. Armstrong.
Thank you, Your Honour. Now, Mr. Gilmore, I'm just trying to understand your evidence about the movement of the front of this fire in its early stages between markers 1 and 11 on the map that we see on the screen. Can I put this to you, and can you please tell me whether you agree with it, that the fire, as it moved away from marker 1, developed an increasingly wide front. One part of the front ran into the October scar, but the southern end of the front continued unaffected by the scar, running down towards marker 11.
No. I think the front ran into the scar.
Right. So, okay.
That would through the slope, as I described before.
All right. Now, when you say through the slope, can I ask you again to comment on this? Does the gully run, in your mind, effectively in a line between markers 1 and 11? Or does the gully, in your mind, run due east from marker 1?
No, it seems like the gully runs from about just to the northwest of marker 1, if the star's the marker, and through about the middle of the red hatching, through the bottom left-hand corner of the triangle, and then hits the scar at about that corner, the next along due to the right. Yes, that corner there. Thank you.
Right.
So you can see there's like a change in vegetation where the gully is there.
All right. You said in your evidence this morning, Mr. Gilmore, that by the time the fire's near edge gets down towards marker 11, it is a front. Am I understanding your evidence this morning correctly?
Yes, correct, yes.
And as it gets close to marker 11, Mr. Gilmore, it's still running along the gully, isn't it?
Yes.
And so the near edge of the fire boundary, as it approaches marker 11, what is it in your mind that causes that near edge to change its character from being a flanking fire to being a head fire?
The available fuel that's in front of it. So as that corner that Mr. Tempone found for me, as it gets
just to pause you, Mr. Gilmore, for the purposes of transcript, you're referring to the southeast corner of the green triangle.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yep. So just below that is the edge of the scar.
Yes.
And as the fire flank gets around that corner as it was, there's nothing stopping it from progressing further to the east. Whereas prior to that, it's hitting up against the edge of the old scar.
Right.
And then once the fire is wide enough to be around that, then I would expect it to be off and running again.
All right. So I take it then, Mr. Gilmore, that the flanking edge of the fire that you conceive to have run around the bottom edge of the October scar, by definition, was a flanking edge of the fire that was travelling as fast as and with the edge of the fire that you describe as the front.
Yes, so the flank starts at the front and goes to the heel, yes.
And then, do I take it from the phenomenon that you're describing that the fire as it reached the area near marker 11 would have been a skinnier path of fire than is later indicated by this fire boundary, because the southwestern flank of that fire would have continued to burn in a slower way towards the southwest, thus widening the burned strip.
I would, apart from the crowning area from marker 11 to marker 8 virtually, which is sort of in a slight L shape, so that burnt with some intensity, like it was crown fire. So I would expect that part to have moved quite rapidly. And it's unclear to me whether it ran from 11 in a southerly direction and then an easterly direction to 8, or something else occurred. I'm not sure.
All right. So back to the area indicated by the red hatching that Mr. Marsden put on this map, which is close to the southwestern part of the green triangle that you've drawn. Do I take it from your green triangle that you would broadly agree with Dr. Marsden Smedley that the fire by about 3 p.m. Had probably reached something like the area indicated by his red hatching?
Yes. Yeah, I think I've said that in one of the reports as well. Yes.
And to be clear, that area is still rising up towards the crest of the ridge that you talked about this morning?
There's actually what I would describe as a saddle through there.
Sorry, a saddle is also the way I used to describe it, but it's been beaten out of me.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
So that the red hatching that we see on this map is still rising up towards the crest of the saddle.
Yes.
And that's the area where you indicated that you thought that there was the best and early potential for long distance spotting.
Yes.
Right. And so by long distance in that description, do you mean the sort of 2.8 kilometre distance that you refer to in your report?
I think no. That's the maximum distance. I would expect. Normally, I would look at about 400 metres. That's quite common. Further than that is uncommon in my experience.
All right. Now, Mr. Gilmore, you gave evidence to His Honour yesterday that in your role as an situation controller, situation manager, or ICT controller of fires, you would defer to the expertise of the specialist fire behaviour modellers in trying to work out the likely path of a growing bushfire?
We would take their advice, yes.
Right. And you're aware, for instance, that bushfires in southeastern Australia have been associated with spotting that extends far, far beyond 400 metres, hasn't it?
Yes.
Indeed, on Black Saturday, there were reports of significant spot fires more than 20 kilometres ahead of the fire front.
I think it may have been in excess of 30, so yes.
I think that's right as well, but I wanted to be conservative. Now, Dr. Marsden Smedley has given evidence, and I think you were in court on Monday to hear the evidence, Mr. Gilmore, that by 3 o'clock and the time that the fire had covered the area indicated by the red hatching here, the fire spotting models that he has found most robust over the course of 25 years' experience indicated that the fire was easily able to be throwing firebrands and causing spot fires well out into the area, at least indicated by the green dot that you see on this map. Did you hear that evidence from Dr.
I think it was 6.8 or something kilometres was the evidence.
Again, I was being conservative, but shall we say, well, let's start with the 6.8. Would you defer to Dr. Marsden Smedley in that assessment?
the model.
Well, yes, his assessment based on the models that he's found most robust.
Yes, I didn't hear any evidence of observed spotting to 6.8. It was about modelling.
Okay.
So, and that's one of the issues with.
Well, we'll come to the issues in a minute, Dr. Marsden-Smith. Dr. Gilmore.
I ask as the witness be permitted to complete his answer, Your Honour.
Very well.
Well, one of the issues with considering the modelling is the inputs. So it's like most decisions, it's the assumptions you make, other things. So is the fuel as the computer thinks it is one of the main things with those models.
Are you familiar with actually using the MacArthur forest fire danger spot fire submodel, Mr.
Yes,
Gilmore?
sir.
Right, and you heard Dr. Marsden-Smedley's evidence on Monday, didn't you?
Yes.
Now, was there anything about his evidence to the court regarding the way in which that he had applied the spot fire submodel that sounded to you like an error?
Only the combination of the two. I would normally use MacArthur's work with MacArthur's work, and the doctor used the Vesta model with MacArthur's work, so that's the only difference that I would have to his methodology.
And have you conducted any study to form a view as to the comparative reliability of the MacArthur fire behaviour model compared to the Project Vesta equation 10 model for the purposes of forest conditions in areas like the Fawcett area of Tasmania?
No, only the papers I've read.
Okay. And so, allowing for that difference, Mr. Gilmore, you've indicated, as I understand it, that you might have done things slightly different, but having heard Dr. Marsden-Smedley's evidence about the way he did it, can I ask you again, did you identify any error, in your view, in the work that Dr. Marsden-Smedley had done to identify the potential maximum reach of spotting from this fire at about 3 p.m. on the 3rd of January 2013?
No, his methodology is quite thorough, is how I would describe it.
Thank you. Now, I've just framed those questions by reference to the maximum and the model. And if we accept that the model indicated that by the time the fire had reached the area indicated by red hatching on this map, it was capable of throwing spot fires out to something like 6.8 or 6.9 kilometres, you would agree, wouldn't you, Mr. Gilmore, that it's entirely plausible that the same fire could very easily be throwing embers across to the area of indicated by the green dot?
I'm surprised by that distance from my experience.
Right. You may be surprised, but you would agree that it's entirely plausible.
I would say it's possible.
Right. And
Possible?
I would
Yes.
think so, yes.
And then working backwards towards the west, Dr. Gilmore, in the area, if we draw a line, for instance, I'm not asking Mr. Temponi to draw a line, but if you might just imagine a line, Mr. Gilmore, between the northwestern edge of your red box that has the green arrow next to it, and draw a line south from there down to the bottom of that grid, that's an area in which you would not at all be surprised to have heard that there were reports of spotting by shortly before 3 p.m. on the 3rd of January.
Perhaps if we started just a little lower, I would think. So yeah, I would imagine it to be directly downwind is what I would be looking at, sir. So so that's another reason why that bit surprised me, if you like, that red.
All right, so the red bit surprised you, but for instance, a spot fire in the area of the yellow dot would not have surprised you?
No.
Oh, okay. Now, just to could we perhaps please, Mr. Temponi, go to Court Book Document 204. Firstly, I tender that MG9, Your Honour.
Yeah.
So 204 is the next one, please, Mr. Temponi. Now, Mr. Gilmore, can I draw your attention to the two grid lines in the top right-hand corner? You see that in the middle of one there's a 3A, and in the middle of the other there's a 3B.
Yes.
Do you see those?
Yes.
Now, His Honour's heard evidence, Mr. Gilmore, in fact I might short-circuit this. For the purpose of preparing to give your evidence today, were you provided with a copy of the transcript of the evidence that had been given by Constable Hall?
I was in court for that.
You were in
Thank
court?
you. Yes.
Right, okay.
Appreciate
So
it.
we're starting with the location at 3A. You'll recall that Constable Hall gave evidence that when he was at Inala Road between about 2:47 p.m. on the day and about 2:52 p.m. on the day, he observed a thin wisp of smoke coming up through what were until then unburned trees in the area of point 3A. Do you recall evidence to that effect?
Yep.
And given what we've been discussing about spotting behaviour from fires, I take it, Mr. Gilmore, that you would agree with Constable Hall's assessment that what he saw in terms of the wisp of smoke rising from that area was very likely a spot fire starting.
Yes, very likely. Yep.
Right. And then at approximately 3 p.m, Constable Hall had driven together with another fire officer around to the area at or very, very close to point 3B, and he identified at that area a small fire of about 200 square metres in area in a gully, and he concluded that that was a spot fire as well. Do you recall that evidence?
Yes, I recall him saying that, yes.
And again, given what we've been discussing this morning about spotting behaviour from a fire in the red hatched area at about that time, would you agree with Constable Hall's assessment that that too was a spot fire ignited by a firebrand emanating from the fire in the red hatched area?
The only thing against that, sir, is the distance. It is, if that's the case, it's the furthest spot fire for the day occurred at that time. So later on, when I would have expected the spotting distance to be further, when the fire was running up Red Hill, the spotting distance was less than that. So that's the only thing that nags about that spot fire to me. And then the other is the position in the landscape. So the upper northern and western slopes are normally the accepted place for spot fires, and anywhere else it's unusual.
All right. Now, did you hear Constable Hall give evidence that after observing the spot fire that I've just described at location 3B, in the course of the next 20 to 30 minutes, he observed a number of other fires ignite further to the east and then slightly to the southeast of location 3B?
Yes, I think he called it a cluster. So, yeah.
That's right, he did call it a cluster, thank you. And again, this was, it would seem, at about 3:20 or 3:30 over the course of that afternoon. And from his description of that further cluster of spot fires, would you agree that taking all of that evidence together, although you might be a little surprised that there was a spot fire thrown to 3B, it does sound like within a very short time after Constable Hall had seen the fire at 3B, there were a number of other spot fires starting as a result of firebrands released from the fire up to the northwest of Inala Road?
What would make more sense to me is that the 3B fire through those spot fires a short distance. So that's, again, back to the 400 or 500 metres sort of distance that is regular. And I think the period of time was half an hour or something like that after. 20
to 30 minutes, he said.
Yeah.
Now, Mr. Gilmore, a fire needs a build-up time before it's likely to start throwing firebrands able to start a spot fire, doesn't it?
Yes.
And a fire that at about 3 o'clock was a relatively low-level fire, not yet crowning in the undergrowth, and a total area of about 200 square metres, is unlikely to have been a fire that was capable of throwing spot fires, is it?
I think the size was not determined in the end. Is that right? I think the fire behaviour eventually described by Constable Hall was of a flank fire that he saw that he couldn't see the other side of, with flames about head high, I think.
Yes.
Yes. So I think that's, if that's what he saw at 3 o'clock and half an hour later there were spot fires slightly downwind of that, that would make sense to me.
All right. Now, as you understand, you're familiar with the type of northing and easting grid line system that's shown on this photograph, aren't you?
Yes.
And you understand the grid lines to be indicating effectively 1 kilometre square.
That's
areas.
correct, yes.
And so the distance from the southeastern edge of the red hatched area across to area 3B is maybe a little over 2 kilometres?
Yes, yeah, that's correct.
Right. And despite the evidence from Dr. Marsden Smedley that the modelling would suggest that by that time the fire was capable of throwing spot fires out to a maximum of something close to 7 kilometres, you still consider it surprising that there might be a spot fire occurring within less than 2.5 kilometres?
Yes.
Right. I need to ask you to explain, Mr. Gilmore, given what you've said about the fire going up the ridge, given what you said in your expert report about the fire potentially throwing spots out to 2.8 kilometres, given the evidence that you heard from Dr. Marsden Smedley, can you explain to His Honour what it is that you find surprising about the possibility that this fire at about 3 p.m. could have thrown a spot fire across to area 3B?
Okay, I would expect it to be a much larger fire, or the area of fuel was uphill and the run was several hundred metres that it had travelled. Quite obvious run. There is one of those on the Red Hill that it's my assumption through the spot fire onto the Wetton flat later in the day. And that went 1.6 kilometres, I think, from running up that few hundred metres. And so I would expect the fire to be larger and running harder to throw that distance.
All right. Now, you've said in your report that the fuels in the area indicated within the red hatched markers on this photograph included stringy bark trees, is that right?
Yes, I think I said something like, I think in reference to spotting, I talked about stringy bark being short distance, gumbark species long distance, and that they were both in the area. I think that's...
I'm sorry, can you just clarify that? Firstly, let's just be clear about what kind of barks there were. There were trees with stringy bark and trees with gumbark, correct?
Yes.
And trees with stringy bark are notorious for throwing spot fires long distance?
Short distance, sir.
Short distance?
Yes.
And trees with gumbark are notorious for throwing spot fires long distance,
Yes,
is that right?
That's correct.
So in terms of the fuels that were available to the fire in the red hatched area, they included fuels that you understand to be notorious for throwing long distance spot fires.
Yes, that's correct.
And the fire in the red hatched area was rising up towards the crest of the saddle, correct?
Yes.
And it was exposed to relatively strong westerly or west-northwesterly winds gusting up to something like 50 kilometres an hour.
Right.
Is that your understanding as well?
Yeah, that would be, yes. The wind speed was in the 30 to 40 range and the gust would be above that, yes.
All right, thank you. And Dr. Marsden Smedley gave evidence that by the time the fire had developed a front width of something like 100 metres, it would be starting to form its own convection column. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, that's part of the Project Vesta work. So
Yes.
I think the accepted width is about 120, but it depends on the wind speed.
All right.
But,
And the effect of the convection column is effectively to suck cooler air in from around the flanks of the fire and send it up into the higher atmosphere.
yes,
And that's one of the phenomena that then also draws smoke upwards into the higher atmosphere.
yes,
And it's one of the phenomena that draws firebrands up
yes,
above the level of the flames and enables them to be caught by wind blowing from whichever direction it might be coming from, correct?
yes.
Now, taking into account, and lastly, your evidence this morning was that you expected that the fire would have been crowning or almost crowning in the trees by the time it reached the south-eastern edge of the red hatched area here.
No, the eastern side. Yeah, the southeastern side shows no evidence of crowning there.
Sorry, I accept the correction. The eastern side of the red hatched area.
Yes.
And you've been to Inala Road, haven't you?
Yes.
And you're aware that the area indicated, that the crest of the saddle is elevated compared to the Lawrence property, for instance, at Inala Road.
Yes. I think there's about a 20-metre difference.
Okay. Now, taking all of those factors into account, Dr. Gilmore, would you agree that although you might be a little surprised that the spot fire might have gone out as far as location 3B, it is nevertheless entirely plausible?
It is possible, yes.
And in your experience, Mr. Gilmore, one of the most dangerous features of bushfires in southeastern Australia is in fact the unpredictability of spotting ahead of a fire, isn't it?
It will move the fire to another location. The most dangerous part of bushfires, certainly for responders, is the change of wind direction, and
yes,
particularly in regard to the focus on the 120 metres is about that risk to bushfire fighters. So during the project that's been talked about, that's developed the models, it was discovered by the CSIRO and people working on it that this 120 metre width of fire took off to its maximum rate of spread. So a fire turning slightly sideways become wider and took off at its maximum rate of spread. So that's where the 120 metres comes from, and it's actually referred to as a dead man zone. They stopped that work and they made videos. So it's accepted, really, that's the most dangerous thing about
Right.
bushfires.
I accept the correction that that is the most dangerous, but I think my question was one of the most dangerous aspects of bushfires in southeastern Australia is the potential for spotting ahead of the fire.
Yeah, and certainly spotting below you. So it's running up towards you is one of our watch out situations if there's a list of them. And
yes. So when you say below you, what you mean is that a person who is in the direction of travel of the fire is in danger from spotting, especially if the spot fire lands behind them as they look at the fire.
Under them on a slope, so it comes up with the wind and the slope. And there's been some fatalities as a result of that because it happens so quickly.
And one of the most dangerous features of spotting is the unpredictability as to where a given spot fire might start in the general direction downwind of a running wildfire.
I think that the danger is that you don't know it's there. That's the danger. So it's in a place you don't know.
Yes, and it's also dangerous because it's very hard to predict where a spot fire is going to start.
Absolutely, yes.
Now, Mr. Gilmore, having regard to all of the evidence that you've collected or been made aware of in relation to the force of bushfire, firstly, to be clear, it remains your opinion that the force of bushfire started at 242 Whitehills Road?
Yes.
That was the only fire that started fresh, as it were, on the 3rd of January 2013 in the Fawcett or Inala Road areas?
Well, apart from these anomalies that I've covered earlier, I have no answers to those. Sorry.
Okay. Now, in terms of the cause of ignition of the fire, you've not been able to identify any evidence that affirmatively indicated a cause of the fire other than the ignition of a tree root within the area of origin identified by you/the TFS.
I only was able to determine possible causes, which are listed in the report.
Okay, so perhaps we just need to deal with them for a moment.
Mm-hmm.
If we could go to back to your second report at Court Book Document 15 and Court Book page 0275. Just to be clear, Mr. Gilmore, the first part of your answer to question 2 deals with the old stump, and we've dealt with that in some detail. Then the next possible cause that you identify appears in paragraph 194. And you refer there to a bulldozed pile of timber and dirt as an ignition source, but you say it's undetermined. Now,
Yes.
in relation to that, Mr. Gilmore, you have no, you haven't seen any evidence to indicate why it might have been that a fire might have initiated in that bulldozed pile of timber and dirt, have you?
No.
Now, down to paragraph 195, you exclude children as a cause. Is that a fair summary?
That is a fair summary.
And then over the page, we can list the first few of these quickly. Power lines were not a cause. Agreed?
Doesn't appear so, no.
Extension power leads do not appear to have been a cause.
No.
Electric pump does not appear to have been a cause. Agreed?
Agreed.
Electric
Yes.
fencing does not appear to have been a cause.
Agreed.
And then the next one is motor vehicles are a possible cause. But apart from your understanding that Mr. Wrigley had been on the property and, well, apart from your understanding that Mr. Wrigley had been on the property, you can't identify anything else that might suggest that motor vehicle exhausts might have been a cause, can you?
No, there was no physical evidence that I saw.
All right.
In relation to that.
Now, paragraph 202, cigarettes are a possible cause, and you refer to the fact that there are some photographs which show the remains of factory bought or alternatively roll your own cigarettes.
Mm-hmm.
His Honour's heard evidence, Mr. Gilmore, that the police officers and the fire service officers who were investigating the scene on the 5th, 6th and 7th of January, or I should say the 5th and 6th, were smoking. Are you aware of that evidence?
I think I may have actually seen that on YouTube, I'm not sure. But yes, I have
All right.
heard something about that.
And His Honour's heard evidence as well, Mr. Gilmore, that the production standards for the production standards for the paper that is used to wrap factory cigarettes or roll your owns require that the paper should self-extinguish unless it's being regularly drawn on by the inhalation of the smoker. Is that your understanding of the production
Yes,
standards?
that was
as well?
yes, in conjunction with investigations by the fire services, and was about or perhaps 10 years ago, or a bit better, and the cigarette paper is modified so that it has bits where it'll go out.
Yes.
And it's mostly about smoking in bed fires.
And the tobacco itself is likely to self-extinguish very quickly if it's not constantly being fanned by further oxygen through the inhalation of the smoker.
I think unless it's sitting into the wind. So if a cigarette is sitting, there's a couple of extra things for this, and I think the weather has been described, and if the end of the cigarette is sort of wind's going into the burning end, not the other end, and if the fuel has been modified. So if the fuel has been round-upped or whipper-snipped or something like that, then it actually deteriorates and becomes more of an available fuel to cigarettes than normal standing grass.
All right. And if a fire has ignited from the end of a burning cigarette, by definition, you're going to have larger flames around the end of the cigarette, aren't you?
Yes, once the adjacent fuel catches fire, yes.
Right. And when you look at the photograph that you've reproduced as figure 21, neither of the factory cigarette in the top left-hand corner nor the roll-your-own stub, as may be, in the bottom right-hand corner show signs of having been exposed to any fire other than the fire associated with somebody smoking them.
Agree. Yes.
Right. So in terms of the identification of those two cigarettes, we can exclude them as the culprits for the ignition of the fire?
I think so, yes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Now over to paragraph 206. There's the possibility of arson, but you've, with the exception of a reference to a blue or dark coloured Holden Commodore, with one male occupant having been seen somewhere between 240 and 242 White Hills Road, there's nothing else to suggest to you that any of the fire activity in the area of the area of 242 White Hills Road or Inala Road on the 3rd of January 2013 was the result of arson, is there?
No.
And then lastly, you exclude lightning as a cause.
Yes.
No, I'm wrong, there's more. Paragraph 214, machinery, you're not aware of any evidence to suggest that there was machinery being used in the area of origin immediately prior to the fire?
No, just the pardon me, the lug tyre tracks were visible and unexplained, so
okay.
I don't know what they're from.
Thank you. In terms of the tracks that you've just referred to, Mr. Gilmore, were you aware at the time of your report that the fire service had parked at least 2 fire trucks or fire appliances in this general area to the east of the house?
I'm aware that, fire appliances were in there, and in fact in that photo you can see in the area of origin where a truck has driven through that area.
And so I think we can tell from that photograph that a truck has driven through it after the area is burned.
That's correct, yes. The burnt remains of the grass squash down when you drive over them and have that lighter appearance.
Yes. Okay. And so there's nothing in the track marks that we see here to suggest that they might be associated with the use of machinery that ignited the fire, is there?
It's just an indication there's been machinery in the area. It's a consideration.
Okay. Then over the page at 218, I beg your pardon, 215 firstly, spot fires from other fires. You excluded that as a possibility?
Yes.
That's all right. And then 218, burn-offs you excluded as a possibility?
Yes, I was unable to find some detail there, but I've excluded it, yes.
Spontaneous combustion is excluded. And then you refer to a solar light. His Honour's heard evidence that the signs of, so far as any information is able to be gleaned from the photographs of the solar light, there's nothing to indicate any kind of short circuit or other damage to the solar light that might be consistent with it having been the cause of the fire. Do you agree with that?
I haven't read that, and I'm not aware of anyone looking at it at the time. That's one of the things that drew my attention to it.
All right. Then at paragraph 230, an angle grinder you discounted as the possible cause. Now, the next one, Mr. Gilmore, paragraph 231, you say that glass refraction of the sun's rays is a possible cause of this fire. Now, is that still an opinion that you hold?
That it's possible, yes.
All right. Now, paragraph 232, you say that the glass must be positioned in such a way that the sun's rays are focused on the fine fuel beneath. Now, His Honour's heard evidence that broadly is consistent with what you've written there. That is that the right-shaped piece of quite high-quality clear glass needs to be held at the right distance above the fine fuel such that it's able to focus the sun's rays on the particular piece of fuel sufficient to generate enough heat to cause it to ignite. Do you agree with that?
That's one of the possibilities in this sort of scenario, yes.
Right. And you haven't seen anything in the evidence to suggest that there was any piece of the right kind of glass with the right kind of shape sitting at the right kind of height above the ground and angled in the right kind of way relative to the sun to suggest that glass reflection was actually a cause of this fire, have you?
No. The discounting of it was
would it be
the thing that drew my attention.
Sorry, thank you. Would it be fair to say, Mr. Gilmore, that these factors that you're listing here are really for completeness as a process of elimination in most respects, and really for none of them is there any actual evidence that they were in fact the cause of the ignition of the Fawcett bushfire?
No, there's no evidence of the ignition, no.
All right. And so, based on all of that analysis and all of the other evidence you've heard, would you agree with me, Mr. Gilmore, that the most plausible explanation, taking into account that perhaps nothing is a perfect explanation, but overwhelmingly the most plausible explanation for the ignition of this bushfire was the mechanism described in the Tasmanian Fire Service report?
Well, the only problem with that for me, sir, is the movement of fire that I've described. So it doesn't align with that theory.
And if you accept that the movement of the fire, I take it you're referring to the movement of the fire in the area of the big log that we discussed yesterday?
Yes, the area we discussed yesterday, yes.
And if His Honour were to conclude, Mr. Gilmore, that the fire patterns that you describe in that area that we'll call the area of the big log are in fact explained by the fire movements that were described by Mr. Robinson and Mr. Walkley and Mr. Bones, then taking that into account, would you agree with me that the overwhelmingly most plausible explanation for the ignition of the Fawcett bushfire was the mechanism identified by the Tasmanian Fire Service?
No, because it hasn't moved away from the origin. The fire's come towards the origin that they identified.
Mr. Gilmore, please listen to the question. Please assume that His Honour disagrees with you as to the fire language in the area of the big log.
Yes.
Please assume that His Honour accepts that the fire indicia in that area are explained by the phenomenon that were described by Mr. Robinson and Mr. Walkley and Mr. Bones. Do you understand the assumption I'm asking you to make?
Yes, I do.
Now, if you make that assumption, I put it to you that the overwhelmingly most likely explanation for the ignition of the Fawcett bushfire was the mechanism described by the Tasmanian Fire Service.
No, to explain properly, which I should have earlier, sorry, the movement across the area to the east and from the bulldoze track that we discussed yesterday across through the area of the pink lines goes from a southerly to a northerly direction, which doesn't gel with the area of origin.
All right. Mr. Gilmore, are you saying that there are two aspects of fire direction that cause you to resist my proposition. The first is the fire language around the area of the big log, and the second is what you've just described as the movement of fire south to north across the area of origin.
Yes.
Are they two distinct things?
No, they're connected, but
All right.
they...
Now, Mr. Gilmore, I'm sorry to have to do this, but I do need to be clear with you. I asked you twice to make an assumption that His Honour finds that Mr. Robinson, Mr. Walkley's and Mr. Bones' explanation for the fire movements in the area of the big log
Yes.
are the correct ones and that you're wrong.
Right.
Do you understand me?
I assume that, yes.
All right. Now, do I also need to ask you to make some assumptions about some separate notion of fire movement across the area of origin? Do I need
If
to deal with
that assists, sir, yes.
All right. What assumption shall we make? Shall we assume that you're wrong about that as well?
If you wish, sir.
Okay. Now, if His Honour were to accept that the movement of fire across that area, that you're wrong about the movement of the area of fire across that area, then would you agree with me that overwhelmingly the most plausible explanation for the ignition of the force of fire was the one identified by the TFS?
It's no, because there's no connection through the excavation.
Well, you don't know that
to a burning
Mr.
area.
Gilmore. You never excavated.
No.
Don't call it an excavation. You scraped away some dirt
No, their
from the top of the
excavation,
stuff.
sir. So their excavation doesn't connect to anything.
All right. Well, neither did yours.
No, that's
So they were the fire
Granted.
investigators there on the ground at the time.
yes.
Based on all of the evidence that they were able to connect, what else do you suggest might have caused that burning route that they found? Burned route.
Burned after the fire. So
Right, so this is back to the idea that a small flame in the dry fuel might have ignited the route and it then burned back underground for a couple of days and at least several metres.
yes,
That's your proposition.
yes.
Now, are you saying that's a possibility, or you think that that's probably what happened?
I'm saying that's probably what happened.
You're saying that the burning route was probably ignited by a fire that already sat there on the ground.
Yes, was ignited by the fire, not the other way around.
Right.
Yes.
What ignited that fire on the ground, Mr. Gilmore?
I don't know, sir.
You can't identify anything.
No,
that would
I have
explain the ignition of
no
that fire.
cause.
Right. And that fire on the ground, let's go through this again because I'm getting quite good at it.
We might have to do it at 2:15.
Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot
That's
about
right.
that. In fact, I was actually watching the clock, Your Honour.
Oh, it's stopped. All right, thanks. I'll adjourn till 2.
Please.
All stand, please. This honourable court now stands adjourned until 2:15 p.m.